Rebecca had always considered herself a trusting person. She had trusted her husband Gregory, a respected preacher in their small Florida town, and his brother Mike, who was often around to help out with the family. They had been a close-knit family, or at least that's what Rebecca had believed. But over the past few weeks, she had started noticing odd things, small changes in behavior, half-heard whispers, and strange looks exchanged between Gregory and Mike whenever they thought she wasn't paying attention. It was enough to raise her suspicions, but Rebecca didn't want to jump to conclusions. She loved her family, and the thought of something being wrong with them seemed impossible. But one evening, after coming back from a quick grocery run, Rebecca was left with a sinking feeling in her stomach. As she walked past the living room, she overheard a hushed conversation between Gregory and Mike. She couldn't make out everything they said, but she caught the words, "She won't find out," and "keep it under control." Those words were enough to set off alarms in her mind. She had always been perceptive, but now, more than ever, she felt the need to dig deeper. Her stomach churned as she tried to brush it off, but the seed of doubt had been planted. After all, there had been little signs. Ethan, her 14-year-old son, had been acting distant lately. He was no longer the happy, open child he once was. He retreated to his room more often, avoiding family activities, and his once sunny disposition had been replaced with a withdrawn, fearful air. The next morning, she found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at her husband's phone, which he had left on the counter while preparing for church. It was a rare moment of opportunity. Rebecca's curiosity took over, and she unlocked it, not sure what she would find, but knowing she had to look. As she scrolled through the messages, her heart began to race. The texts between Gregory and Mike were chilling. They spoke cryptically, referring to keeping things quiet, and there was a message from Gregory saying, "She can never know what happened." The realization hit her like a punch in the gut. Rebecca quickly set the phone down, her hands shaking. It was clear now. Whatever was going on between Gregory and Mike, it involved her son. She couldn't fathom it. Her mind scrambled to make sense of the discovery, but nothing made sense. She tried to convince herself it was a misunderstanding, but deep down she knew better. The pieces were falling into place. Gregory, her husband, the man she had trusted above all, had been hiding something. Something dark. By that evening she had resolved to confront him. She couldn't stand to live with this knowledge for one more moment. The house, once a place of comfort and security, now felt like a prison. When Gregory returned home from church, Rebecca greeted him with a forced smile. But inside, her heart was pounding in her chest and her mind was racing. She needed answers. "Gregory, I need to know what's going on. Why are you and Mike acting so strange? What have you been hiding from me?" Gregory looked at her with a mixture of surprise and guilt. "What are you talking about, Rebecca?" he asked, his voice tight. "Don't lie to me," Rebecca said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "I know something's going on. What is it? What have you been doing with Mike and Ethan?" Gregory hesitated, his eyes darting away. For the first time, Rebecca saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he stood there in silence, unable to meet her gaze. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. "I know, Gregory," she whispered. "I know what you've done, what you've both done to Ethan." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She saw the fear and panic flood his face, and that was all the confirmation she needed. There was no more denying it. The night dragged on in a blur, but Rebecca knew she couldn't let it go. She had to get to the truth. No more lies, no more secrets. Ethan had to know, and she had to know everything. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Rebecca decided to act. She couldn't let them get away with it. As the sun set that evening, Rebecca waited until the house grew quiet. Ethan had retreated to his room, just as he always did. Gregory and Mike had gone into the living room, and Rebecca knew this was her chance. With trembling hands, she made her way down the hallway, moving toward Ethan's door. But as she approached, she heard something. A muffled voice. And then the unmistakable sound of her son crying. Rebecca froze. A deep, cold feeling settled in her chest. Something was wrong. Something terrible. She pushed the door open, her breath catching in her throat. The sight before her made her heart stop. Gregory and Mike were standing over Ethan, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, his face streaked with tears. They weren't just talking to him, they were touching him, violating him in ways Rebecca couldn't even comprehend. Ethan was shaking, unable to fight back, and Gregory and Mike were too focused on their own sick, twisted conversation to notice Rebecca standing there. For a moment everything felt frozen. Rebecca couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her husband, the man who had promised to love and protect their family, was now one of the men responsible for the abuse of their son. Her mind couldn't make sense of it, but the reality of the situation crashed down on her. This was real. This was happening. She couldn't look away, even as her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. "What are you doing?" Rebecca finally found her voice, her words trembling with a mix of disbelief and fury. Gregory and Mike turned around, their eyes wide with shock and fear. They had been caught. There was no more pretending, no more lies. "Rebecca, it's not what you think," Gregory began, his voice shaking. "Please, let me explain," Rebecca's voice cut him off. "No, Gregory, no more lies. I saw everything. I heard everything. What you've done to Ethan—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the weight of the betrayal too much to bear. "You don't get to explain this away." Ethan was still sitting on the bed, tears running down his face, his body trembling with fear. He was too scared to speak, too scared to do anything. Rebecca rushed to his side, pulling him close. "You're safe now, baby. I'll protect you. Always." Gregory and Mike stood frozen, unable to move or speak. They knew the truth had come out, and there was no escaping the consequences. Rebecca was no longer the scared wife she had once been. She was a mother, and she would do anything to protect her son. Without a word, Rebecca moved toward the drawer where she had hidden her gun. She had never planned for things to escalate like this, but she knew she couldn't let them escape. The fear and rage within her were too strong. She couldn't let them harm Ethan any longer. With steady hands, she pulled out the gun and aimed it at them. "You're not getting away with this," she said, her voice cold and unyielding. "Not this time." Before they could react, Rebecca pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing in the small house. Gregory and Mike collapsed to the floor, their bodies lifeless. The room was filled with the stench of gunpowder, and Rebecca stood there, her breathing heavy, her hands shaking. She had done it. The men who had destroyed her family, who had destroyed her son's innocence, were gone. But the reality of what she had just done hit her like a freight train. She had taken their lives. But it was the only choice she had. Ethan was still in her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She held him tight, whispering reassurances into his ear. "It's over, baby. You're safe now. They can't hurt you anymore." The police would come soon. The neighbors would hear the gunshot and know what had happened. Rebecca didn't know what would come next, what the consequences of her actions would be. But for the first time in days, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had protected her son. As the sirens grew louder in the distance, Rebecca made a silent promise to herself. She would face whatever came next, because she had done what any mother would do to protect her child, and for that, she had no regrets. Rebecca never imagined her life would be defined by the events of that night. After discovering the unthinkable, she had acted out of desperation, love, and the overwhelming desire to protect her son. But now, as she stood in the courtroom, the trial was nothing short of a media frenzy. The small Florida town that had once known peace was now polarized, divided between those who believed Rebecca had done what any mother would, and those who saw her actions as unjustifiable murder. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and the curious, all waiting to hear how the case would unfold. Rebecca, once a woman filled with hope and love, now sat in the defendant's seat. Her posture was slumped, her eyes hollow from weeks of preparation, but above all it was the weight of the truth that bore down on her. She had shot and killed her husband Gregory and his brother Mike, two men she had once trusted with her life. But they had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way, and now she had to pay the price. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case. They painted Rebecca as a woman who had acted out of cold-blooded vengeance. Yes, she had been a victim, they argued, but there were other ways to handle the situation. They made it clear that there was no room for vigilantism in the justice system. They highlighted the fact that Rebecca had time to think before she shot the two men. She could have restrained them, called for help, or gone to the police. Instead, she took justice into her own hands, and now she must face the consequences. Rebecca's defense team, however, fought back. They presented her as a mother who had been pushed to the edge. The defense attorney argued that Rebecca's actions were not premeditated, but rather a desperate attempt to protect her son from further abuse. They highlighted Ethan's testimony and the deep emotional trauma he had endured at the hands of Gregory and Mike. It was not just about murder. It was about a mother trying to save her child. The emotional heart of the trial came when Ethan took the stand. The boy who had once been full of life now sat in the witness box, his face pale and his hands trembling. The courtroom was silent as he recounted the horrors of that night, his voice barely audible at times as the memory of the abuse haunted him. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to turn to," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I was trapped. I was too scared. But when Mom came in, I knew she was saving me. I don't know how much longer I could have held on." His testimony was heart-wrenching, and it resonated deeply with the jury. The defense attorney used Ethan's words to argue that Rebecca had been driven by a mother's instinct to protect her son from further harm. She had acted in a moment of panic, not as a calculating killer, but as a woman who felt she had no other choice. But the prosecution wasn't swayed. They argued that while Ethan's abuse was a tragic part of the story, it didn't excuse murder. They focused on the fact that Rebecca had taken matters into her own hands, without considering the consequences. The law, they argued, had been put in place for a reason, to prevent people from taking the law into their own hands. Rebecca had become judge, jury, and executioner in one impulsive moment. Finally, the jury returned with their verdict. Rebecca could hardly breathe as the foreman stood, ready to read the decision. She had prepared herself for the worst, but the words still hit her like a blow. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder." The words echoed through the courtroom, and Rebecca's heart sank. Second-degree murder meant that the jury believed she had not planned the killings, but had acted in the heat of the moment. It wasn't premeditated, but it was still murder. The judge addressed the court. "Rebecca Dawson, you have been convicted of second-degree murder in the deaths of Gregory Dawson and Mike Dawson. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in prison." Rebecca's body went numb as the words sank in. She had expected a long sentence, but hearing it aloud made it all too real. 25 years behind bars. A life she had once built with love and trust was now shattered. As the bailiff moved to escort her away, Rebecca glanced toward Ethan, who was sitting with his grandmother in the front row. His eyes were filled with sadness, but there was also a sense of understanding. He didn't blame her. He knew what she had done was to protect him, and though he would never fully heal from the trauma of what had happened, he would always remember the mother who had fought for him. Rebecca was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her heart heavy with the weight of her conviction. She had lost everything, her family, her freedom, and her place in the community. But there was one thing she still had, the knowledge that in the end, she had protected Ethan. And she couldn't undo the past, but she would carry the memory of that night with her forever. As she was taken away, she held on to one thought. She had given her son the chance to live, and that was the only thing that mattered.